Now that was church. And Irenaeus was immersed in first century church. There were no pews, there were no stained glass windows, there weren't even the red pew pads at the end of your pew. But there was fellowship across boundaries. There was song with room for the Spirit. And maybe most importantly, there was a table that was welcome for all. So why do we return to this mysterious moment in between Jesus' crucifixion in AD 30 and the official recognition of the Christ movement by the Roman Empire in the 4th century? I propose that the reason may be that within this root of early Christian worship, we may find the blueprint for an inclusive, for a spirit-led, and for a prophetic future. And it began with a simple table. Eating together, as you all know from Messy Church and from your everyday lives, is the primary way of initiating social relationship. This is why if you ever see an email from me, you'll see, "Pizza is provided," in all caps. Because there's something about food that brings people together. Even before Christianity, the meal was the central form of worship within the Hellenistic Mediterranean. And Jesus knew this. So Jesus was building on a structure that was already in place. And as you look through Jesus' story, you see that Jesus was always popping in and eating at folks' houses. And his ministry culminated in a meal, the Last Supper. But what I think is really interesting is that Jesus' parables were also fixated on this notion of food and the power of food. If you look at Matthew, if you look in Luke, and if you look in the Gospel of Thomas, you find this story of a host that has this amazing impetus to gather people together. And I think this story will seem familiar to a lot of us. So he or she is really excited to bring people together, so she sends her friends to gather the people. Going out to all the invited guests, the servant asks, "Will you come to this dinner?" And how do you think the people responded to this extravagant welcome? PTA meeting, soccer, Floyd Mayweather fight, all very legitimate excuses or reasons for not going. But they didn't show up. They didn't take the invitation. But the host was called to have the meal anyway. But not only to have the meal, but to go out into the streets and invite anybody that would answer the call. So who shows up? Who built the early church? Now this is a time where we have to unlearn, because we think of a bunch of white guys, probably looking like me in some funny hats, right? Building the church, when in reality, the people that really galvanized the movement were slaves, were people of lowly status, and were aristocratic women that were willing to pay for it all. They would gather together, and it was usually the more wealthy person that would have them all over to their house. Scholars like Dennis Smith and Hal Talzak have used the accounts of Philo and others from the period to recreate these gatherings. The liturgy was simple. All we have to think about is Messy Church. They were eating, they were reading, they were singing, they were making mistakes, there was awkward moments of silence, and they were worshiping. And finally, after all of that worshiping, the floor was open and they were debating. So what I'm trying to argue is that instead of this narrative that a whole bunch of bishops came together and decided what the Orthodox way of believing would be, that there was about 200 years of people coming together and debating these issues of faith. And as you heard modeled so beautifully by Elizabeth Honer and Elaine Wells, the singing was often improvisational. They would take a part of the sacred text and they would riff on it, kind of like a jazz club. And born out of those riffs were the Odes of Solomon. And the Odes of Solomon are so great, and I'm not just pitching a New Testament because I want you all to buy it, But it's eye-opening stuff, because within the Odes of Solomon are invitations to have multiple identities. The way that these songs were sung, at one moment you would be the odist. You would be singing your praises to God. In another moment, you would be standing as if you were Christ. And at another moment, you'd be taking on the identity of Wisdom Sophia. And isn't that what church is all about? A space that's big enough to include all that we are, and a space that's grand enough for us to be lost in all that we can be when we are one with God. And the odes really capture that. And not only do they capture that on an individual level, but on a collective level, they take some amazing stances. You hear in the Old Testament some really prophetic wisdom against institutional slavery. But in the New Testament, it's hard to find anything that condemns something like slavery as directly as Ode 20. So therefore, these texts within the last 100 years have come out of the ground magically, and they show us that our intuition about what these Christ people were like is probably a lot more like what we intuited already. It opens the door. After worship, a theological and ethical debate would ensue. Everything from what did it mean to live a kosher life to who was this God that we were serving was on the table. There was very little authoritarian presence, but there was definitely some. There were in many cities, because this was built in urban centers, there was what they called a presbyter bishop, who would be in charge of making sure that the teachings were in line with the Christ movement, that there was some uniformity within what they were talking about. Because if everyone was just talking about whatever, if I'm talking about the Mayweather fight and you're talking about the Holy Spirit, then there probably wouldn't be the kind of unity that would bring us this far. So there was authoritative presence. But as you see in the Apostle Paul's letters, these were simply households of God, and people had agency to bring their wide range of theological beliefs and even wider range of human experience. The anthropologist Peter Farb says, to know what, where, how, and when, and with whom people eat and worship is to know the character of the society. I'll repeat that. To know what, where, how, when, and with whom people eat and worship is to know the character of their society. Amongst increased racial strife, broadening economic disparity, and, sorry folks, and especially sorry for me, the decline of the mainline Christian denominations, there are a lot of doubts right now about whether or not the church as a whole is living into its call for radical inclusivity, spirit-led worship, and prophetic teaching. In a week where everyone seems to be quoting Dr. Martin Luther King for their own purposes, unfortunately I will do the same. 11 a.m. on Sunday morning is the most segregated hour of the week. People are leaving churches in droves, and this might be one of the most exciting moments in our history. Again, people are leaving, but it's also one of the most exciting moments in our history. For what I've seen in seminary and what I see every Sunday at First Congregational Church, there are congregations that seem to be sensing, that are already responding to this moment that almost feels like a next Reformation. It's almost in the words or in the thoughts of Carl Jung, like our collective unconscious are going back to simplicity through initiatives like Messy Church. And I would posit that with all of this increase in sacred texts that we haven't been faced with before, we merely need to know what has been there since the beginning. As we listen to the teachings of Jesus, and as we go back to the open table, we find an invitation that is at the root of our faith, an invitation to be all that we are before God and to be all that we are with one another. And to conclude in this moment, I would say that I see three things that are parallel between the early church movement and this moment, especially embodied at FCC. And the first is radical inclusivity. The table of fellowship of early Christianity was an invitation to overturn the hierarchies of society. All the different expressions of God were dining together. With the uprisings in Baltimore and the growing economic divides, the time is now to take this model seriously and apply it to our context. However, I think the Second Reformation is demanding us to not only be inclusive of all of the surface level ways that we divide each other in terms of what we may look like, what our economic status may be. Those things are pretty clear that we have to subvert those boundaries. But what I think is really exciting is that this Second Reformation is also asking us to be all that we are internally. All of the different expressions of self that are contained in this one body. During the week, whether you're in high school and you're thought of as an emo kid, or you are a grown person and you are in the role of a librarian, there are different roles that we are all asked to play 6 days a week. And we are always guessing, am I playing into that role correctly? Am I living into people's expectations of me? What if the church, what if this community was a place where we could really take the mask off? What if this was a place where we could let all the crazy out? All the multiple voices. I'll say that again. Take the mask off and let all the crazy out. Because you know there's a lot of crazy in here, and especially in this pulpit, there's a lot of crazy in here. And I think that that's what Jesus was inviting us to do, to let the crazy out. And the worship texts, which are now surfaced from Egypt, magically, we can look at it, Odes of Solomon, have multiple identities, multiple voices within one song. And we all know that we have multiple sides of ourselves. And we all know that we're thirsting for a space where we can let all of those out, to take the mask off and let the crazy out. Next, I think that it's a time for collective wisdom, and I think it's time for an even more radical call to justice. The brilliance, again, of the Odes of Solomon are that there are so many different voices that make up the song. There are multiple perspectives and identities. This was a time when, like Jesus, people were wrestling with their Jewish tradition, but also taking radical steps to find a new way of being together. I would say that the 1st through 3rd centuries were actually a lot more interfaith than we are today. And that may get me stoned in some congregations, but I really think that's true. Because they had the pagan religions of Rome, they were taking their Jewish heritage seriously, and they were creating a new thing. And the youth group went and heard Ibu Patel. And Ibu Patel reminded us that we live in one of the most interfaith countries in human history. And I think that we take a lot of different perspectives to the table at FCC. And what I think that this next moment in Christianity is inviting us to do is to be brave about saying, yeah, I'm reading about Buddhism. Yeah, I'm reading about Hinduism. But I'm also rooted in the ethics of Jesus. I'm going to bring all of these views to the table, hoping that they will bring me closer to walking with God, closer to the Spirit, and closer to one another. Finally, I think we just go back to the basics. We are really blessed to have this amazing cathedral of a congregation and of a church, but many churches don't have such a beautiful building. Many of them have been sold. But I think what FCC has seen is that if we just gather on a Wednesday night, if we just have a yard sale, community is formed. And that's powerful, especially if we're bringing radical inclusivity to those spaces. If we are bringing calls to justice and we're holding each other accountable, that's extremely powerful. So back to the basics. And what's funny, too, is I thought about the yard sale and Messy Church. And like the early church, they were organized primarily by women. Our unconscious is just following this path that has already been in place. Finally, in order for our story to continue, we must return to our root. We must travel to new places in the name of inclusivity, in the name of justice, and we must find the Spirit there. We cannot do that if we play the roles that we think we're expected to play. We cannot do that if our only movement is from a pew to an altar. The Spirit is inviting us to discover new corners of ourselves through one another and a greater sense of oneness within the divine. I will end by taking the words of one of my favorite authors, James Baldwin, who said, "If the concept of God and our concept of church, if they have any validity or any use, it can only be to make us larger, to make us freer, and to make us more loving. If our concepts of God and our concepts of church are not doing this, then they are probably not God, and it's probably not church at all." So, thank you.